Eric with Smart Pot Fabric Planners, and this week our guest is Ben Owens. He's a co author and home growing advocate and consultant. He's been on the podcast with us before, and we wanted to get him back to talk about all things pertaining to the home growing of cannabis. So, Ben, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, good to talk with you again. So, first question, how has home growing changed in the last 10 years or so? Do you see home growing becoming more or less popular, staying the same?
It's interesting. Like, I started growing in 2019, so I've really only been growing for about half of the time that in that 10-year window. And when I moved here in 2015, so that's almost that 10-year window. And I would say that it's become a lot more common. The knowledge surrounding how to grow is a lot more common. I think that that's one of the biggest things that holds people back is they are afraid they're going to screw it up and they don't know where to turn for advice. And in previous years, during previous times of enforcement, it was a lot harder to get that advice, that mentorship, that coaching. And now it's a lot more accessible, whether you want to work with somebody, one on one or in a group setting or attend a live event. A lot of these grow shops are now hosting events. There's one this weekend that's a seed exchange, and those are things that just couldn't happen without that legal pretense.
Yeah, definitely. And you've been doing a grow hort. Um, can you explain what that is and how that's been going?
Absolutely. Yeah. We're wrapping up the third GROWOR, and that wraps up on the 18th. So they graduate and they'll be consuming cannabis that they grew for the first time at home. So that's always exciting. We've had, I think, 8 states now as far as the spread of participants. We get some hot spots in Illinois and Colorado with legalization. But it's been a learning process for all of us. It's something to know how to do something. It's a totally different task and skill to be able to teach people what you do and how to do it and communicate, without ever being in their grow, without ever physically seeing their plant, communicate how to do things, how to look for things, what they should be feeding and monitoring and changing and everything that's involved in growing. So it's been a fun process.
Yeah, definitely. If anybody's watching this video and they want a coach to walk them through the process, definitely get in touch with Ben. So, IPM and clean growing is just important for home growers as it is for commercial growers. So, what are some things that hobby growers should be mindful of to grow their cleanest plant possible?
So when it comes to IPM for hobby growers, there's a boundary or a barrier in the cost. A lot of IPM chemicals or chemistries or applications or practices and processes even these days are very expensive. And while they are valid, there's a ton of value in these chemistries. There's also a lot of value in just general cleanliness, and I say that with the nicest way I can. But a lot of us believe that we are clean people, that we live a clean life. And you would be surprised at how dirty we all are, actually. We may wear the same shoes that we walk the dog in through the house, and that may not be like a massive thing, but you could be potentially tracking spores in, bugs in, decaying material, all sorts of contaminants. And so when I talk to hobby growers, especially with the GROWOR, Zach and I wrote Clean Growing. It's a great resource, but again, it references a lot of these more advanced tools. So if you're a basic grower or you're a first time grower, general cleanliness of, being mindful of contaminants, showering if you've been out in your outdoor greenhouse with vegetables before you go into your indoor grow, you know, even just being mindful of the plants in your house. My wife has a lot of house plants, and you know, I have the tools to do IPM in the grow, and sometimes I have to bring them upstairs and treat the house plants. But it's something that we're mindful of to avoid that cross contamination. And so, if I'm taking care of the house plants, or I'm taking care of the greenhouse, or I've been over at a buddy's house plant sitting, I try to make a distinct separation between that and my own grow, whether that means, I take care of my grow in the morning and then I shower and I do all the things about my day and then I go to my buddy's grow, or I go to my buddy's grow first and plant sit and then I come home and I shower before I go into my own grow. So I think that's my biggest advice is for home growers is, the contamination factor is truly a big thing. The other thing is a stable environment. If you don't have big swings in your humidity and temperature and you don't have contamination, you're going to avoid a lot of problems. Zach and I talk about in the book this pest triangle, pest pathogen triangle. And the idea is that you have to have a conducive environment, a susceptible host, and you have to have the threat there. And a lot of these threats are always there. We live in places where powdery mildew is very common outdoors, especially in vegetable gardens, things like that. And so not every strain affects every plant, but these threats are not just, they don't exist in a vacuum, and they are always there. So as long as you have healthy plants and you aren't, making an environment that's very unstable and very conducive to problems, you're going to end up avoiding a lot of those issues. And then the third thing that I recommend to people is don't let everybody in your grow. It's super tempting to want to show your grow off and, oh, come look at the plants. This is my first time, or even this is my 100th time. You want to show people the grow. And even in my own grow, like I've transitioned to not opening the tents. Like a lot of tents have windows now, and it's very tempting to want to just unzip everything and be like, look at these plants. Isn't this amazing? And it is, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of it's exciting to share. But at the same time, whatever your friends have been exposed to is potentially now in your grow. And so, if you want to show them through the window of the tent, if you are more selective with who you let into your house and your grow, then it may not be an issue. But I find that those are big sources of contamination, and it's unwitting. It's people who are just very eager and excited about growing that end up getting some sort of problem as a result of showing everyone and their mother their plants every time they come over.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to stay clean than it is to get rid of a problem. So I really love your tips. 100% agree with all of those.
Ounce of
Um,
prevention is worth a pound of cure, as they say.
100%. So I would say that clones seem to be much less prevalent now than they were 15 years ago when I started growing. It used to be you could pretty much only get clones easily. How should hobbyists choose their genetics and go about that process? And then, what are your thoughts on pheno hunting for the home grower?
So, from a standpoint of clones, there's it's the other side of IPM. Honestly, it's something I didn't mention, which is when you're bringing plants in from someone else, it's the same thing as bringing a friend in. You're bringing potential contaminants with you. With a plant, there's likely more potential contaminants because they don't shower daily and general hygiene practices. But the clone market is interesting because I talk to people in California who don't, they've never paid more than $40 a clone, and clones are readily available of every cut and strain and genetic that you could possibly want. And then you look at the Midwest. I have friends in Missouri. They spend hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars to get certain clones. So, and I say this because it's funny of the timing of this call with you is because I got a clone in the mail this morning that is the first clone I've accepted in a few years, and a buddy of mine and we went in on this clone, and he wanted it shipped to my house, and that was fine. But the idea was, it's been so long since I took a clone in that I was like, oh, I got to do like IPM, like I got to do things. I can't just go throw this in a pot and throw it into the veg light. Got to do a dunk and got to do a rinse, and do some of these things to just mitigate it, and it's in quarantine in the 2x4 next to me, and it'll be there for, a couple weeks just to make sure everything's clean. But clones are an interesting market because there's now rampant fear of certain things like hop latent viroid. And HLV is not something to joke about. It can decimate a crop, but it's also something that is very inconsistent and seemingly very hard to diagnose and detect and fix, for that matter. There are people who can claim that they have fixed it, but there is still some belief that it is a systemic problem that will remain latent and could eventually pop back. So I think that the fear of potentially contaminating your garden, and not just like, oh, I got bugs, which was the old fear. Now it's like this silent killer that's going to hang out in your arrow cloner and you don't know it's there. And is it really worth it? And that's where like quarantine practices, things like that come into play, is like making sure you titrate your risk. But I love growing from seed, and I had this conversation on a hash podcast recently. They were asking from a hash standpoint, is it better to grow from seed and hunt your own or to buy clones? And I think the short answer is if you have a specific end game in mind, whether that's flower that you've always enjoyed at a dispensary and you always love that dispensary's cut of Durban or whatever it might be, growing from seed is probably going to be disappointing. You're not going to find that exact variety, especially the more rare that it might be. If they hunted 400 seeds and they found one that expressed in this unique way, and that's why it's a standout plant, that's amazing. But that means you have a 1 in 400 chance of finding something similar from the pack you bought. And so I still think there's value in hunting from seeds. I think that the future of commercial is definitely going to go to the feminized seed realm. But from a home grower's perspective, clones are this gray area because of, things like plant counts and things like transporting hemp material and, clones in the mail. Like is it hemp or is it cannabis? And so I think seeds are a lot easier from that perspective. There's less risk. Um, there's also the collection factor. I this came up is that you can buy as many seeds as you want. You can have a seed buying problem like many of us do and end up with a large vault. But if you have a clone buying problem, you have a much more immediate problem, which is that those plants are going to need to be kept alive and eventually going to need to be grown in some fashion, whether they need to be turned into moms or they need to be flipped or they need something. But I had clones, and this is the problem we all get is we have a lot of friends who grow and they're like, hey, I got all these new ones, and so when I first started growing, I had someone who offered me all these different cuts from archive and I was really excited. I had brought back a couple cuts myself and so we swapped and it was great, but it took me like a full year to run these 6 new cuts and just work them into my routine of already planned aspects. So I think clones present their own challenges. If you have a very specific goal, you want a very specific flavor, a very specific yield, maybe it's for rosin, maybe it's for terpenes, specific terpenes are desirable, maybe it's minor cannabinoids, something like that that's been hunted, I think is very valuable. But if you have the luxury and the space to hunt your own packs and you want something a little bit more unique and you're okay with that trial and error, I think that that's going to be the better bet for the long term because you're going to have something different from everyone else. You're going to be able to go through that process of hunting for something which, there's a joy in the hunt itself, but also the reward of finding it, not just being like, oh yeah, this is so and so's cut that I purchased. And it's something that like when I started growing, I took a lot more cuts in. And over the past few years, I've been really growing from seed. I've accumulated a lot of seed, obviously, but it's mostly because I want to find something that other people don't have, that is not readily available on the dispensary shelf. And I tell people, like, don't grow the same weed that you can go buy at the dispensary 10 minutes from your house. Like, it's not shade on that weed. It's just, it takes a lot to grow, it takes a lot to hunt. And if you're going to go to all that effort, why do it for the exact same thing that you could buy even a high end ounce? Say you're buying the highest end ounce is $500. You could buy it right now. There's a lot quicker payoff in that than there is buying a grow, setting it up, learning to grow, learning to feed, those daily waterings, all the things involved for the exact same thing.
Totally, totally. So, kind of a similar question. What are you growing these days, and what's popular in general, genetics wise?
Oh man, so that's a fun question. I've been on a hunt to pop more seeds this year. I've got a good friend, Weed Shanty, and he has been encouraging me not to only pop a few at a time. So I popped 43 seeds, I think, in the last round, and that was based on before that I popped 37, and 4 of them have made it to this far into flower without herming or being a male or being a runt or mutant or something. And so that unfortunately doesn't speak well for seed stock, but it's also my style of growing. There are plants that might respond better to a rock wool grow. And maybe those runts that I threw away might have been monsters in rock wool. But unfortunately, I can't keep around the what ifs that don't fit with my setup. And so I'm trying to be more diligent about that and not treat every plant as a potential unicorn that I'm throwing away because the reality is, they're not. With that said, I've been hunting. I hunt with a balance for flower and for hash. So my wife, she enjoys flower. I'm a concentrate consumer primarily, and we go back and forth, but that's the balance. And so when I'm hunting, I'm often hunting hash packs, and I've been recently hunting a lot of Terp Fountain genetics. He is a breeder out of Michigan. He was a hash maker out here in Colorado, and so that was a unique kind of transition from somebody who makes hash to someone who's breeding specifically for hash, and that attracted me, as well as the flavor profiles. I have one of almost every one of his packs. I think there's one or two that slipped through the cracks, but I was buying those specifically for the hashability, and found a real nice keeper of the red smoothie. So I really enjoy that. It's got those, like if you were in a 7-Eleven and those red gas station Slurpee type terps. So
Nice.
it's a unique find. But aside from Terp Fountain, Crystal Rose is someone that I've found luck with. His Pie Eyed has done well on the East Coast. That's what attracted me to him, and I ended up finding one that did pretty well. I'm hoping to run her again soon. I ran his Terp slushies. Those are two of the four seeds that made it this far into flower from the 37 were two from Crystal Rose. So, and the other two were bag seeds, believe it or not. But I've been growing a lot of the same stuff over and over, and that's where this seed hunt has kind of come. Is I'm trying to expand. I've been popping more and more. The refresher, actually, that's a Tropicana cookies crossed with strawberry OG cookies. That's an Ethos genetic, and that came out amazing. It's a very small head stash type plant. It's not a yielder by any means, but it throws these gorgeous blackish blue leaves, and it smells like straight banana peels. When you open up a jar, it's like ripe banana peel, not the banana itself, just the peel. And so that's been a really cool find. But other than that, I'm also just randomly making seeds in my house. I have a 2x2 setup that I call the Love Shack, and so hunting through some of those, hunting through some seeds from friends that have just decided to make seeds, and trying to give some small guys some pop in. I'm growing the knuckle puck right now, actually, which is grip tape and Donnie Burger, I believe, and that was made by a fat kid out of Oklahoma City, Big Dave, and he doesn't release seeds, but that was hooked up through Zach Ricciardi, my co-author, and those seeds are supposed to be great for hash. The lineage and the history behind the provenance is very specific for hash. So that's what I'm hunting, is primarily hash strains. Got a few others in the mix, but with the limited space, I like to blend it up. And my wife also likes very different profiles, terp profiles, than I do. So it presents a very unique ability to hunt. I get to hunt through things that may not have been my top shelf selections, but they end up being pretty fire.
Nice, nice. So, you kind of touched on growing for flower versus growing for hash. What are some characteristics of a cannabis plant that's going to be better for extracts versus not? And then how do we find those genetics?
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question. I think that the short answer is looking to see what's already working. Meaning, like if you were going to go buy a seed pack right now, I would say go buy Turp Fountain Genetics, Bloom Seed Co., Crystal Rose. Some of these well-known hash specific breeders. Whereas if you were just growing for hash and you didn't know what you were getting into, and you were looking for a plant that might be hash worthy, um, there's tests that you can do to the plant itself. But I guess if you aren't growing the plant and you're just like, hey, I'm buying seeds, what should I look for? I would say proven washers, breeders who have experience with hash specifically. You know, like I know a lot of breeders that are flower consumers, and through no fault of their own, their selections are for flower. So they're not selecting for plants that are made for hash. They're selecting for the best, most gorgeous, best fragrance flower. And that selection process is going to impact the lineage. And so those seeds, like a perfect example is Lovin' in Her Eyes. I run some of her gear. She's a great grower out here in Colorado. And her orange ice pop actually is still in rotation for me. It's got a mothball orange flavor. But I was talking to her and I said, is this a plant? Like, is this a pack that I could hunt for like a washer? And there's 6 seeds in every one of her packs. And she said you'd have to hunt a few packs, which is her nice way of saying like this is more of a flower oriented strain. And it's not that it's not possible, but you're not going to pop one plant and get it. Whereas the red smoothie, I popped the seed, I got a hasher that did 5% in the wash. And that was a lucky draw as well. I could have gotten a lower one. The Fruity Pebbles OZ that I did from Terp Fountain did like 2.5%. But I knew going into it what the lineage was, who the breeder was, and how it had performed for other extractors. So, like, I joke that I still subscribe to dispensary newsletters. And the reason I do is because I'm constantly looking at what strains are in rotation for their hash offerings, for rosin, for, vapes, whatever it might be. What are they running regularly? And there is a catch 22 to this, which I'll discuss, but the idea is like they're hunting more seeds, they're running more plants, they have larger grows, and they're doing more at scale, and they're washing more material at scale. They're going to have a better sense of what is sustainable and what makes sense to put on the shelf. Also, what people are into, what people are liking. That's a factor. I talked about this with a buddy about Trop Cookies. I had this belief that Tropicana OG cookies, Trop Cookies, was this amazing washer because it's regularly seen in rosin form. It's seen in all sorts of extracts out here in Colorado. And apparently it's not. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad washer. Like, for example, the Refresher does like 0.6% to wash. It was a terrible washer, amazing hash. I will never wash it again. The Trop Cookies does like mid-range, apparently, but it's so popular as a consumer front that when patients come in or when consumers come in, it warrants them selling it because even though they may not get as many grams from the plant, all of the grams sell. Whereas there's no standing inventory. So that's the catch 22 with like gauging some of these insights on other people's menus is you don't know what decisions are being made on the back end and they're like, it's a loss leader, let's just run it. But it does give you a sense if you're starting to see things regularly on the menu, you can at least get a sense of like what is working. Like chemis, Chem de la Chem, those kinds of mixes and rotations were very common at Verde for a while. Dablogic was running Chem everything. And, they also have a hazelnut cream cross that's amazing. But they hunted through like 400 plants to find that, to find a plant that had that profile and washed. So it's very, I wouldn't say like go buy a pack of hazelnut cream, you're going to find an amazing hash plant. But there's a potential that there's a unicorn depending on how many plants you want to hunt.
Totally. So last question, Ben. You had mentioned bottlenecks in the grow when we were discussing topics for the interview. Can you please describe what you or others have encountered as roadblocks to success and how to mitigate or avoid them altogether?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest bottleneck is space. Space and time. Those are kind of the obvious ones. Um, I like to joke that the number one rule of Grow Club is we don't talk about plant counts, but plant counts are a real thing. And if you're trying to remain compliant and you're trying to abide by the laws, it can be very hard to have rigorous standards that you uphold. And I say that meaning like when I would pop seeds, I would only pop one or two seeds because I could only space wise, plant count wise, time wise afford to have two potential moms, and clones from those moms and so on and so forth. But like keeping two identical moms around and alive until I went through all the way from seed to smoking it to enjoying it. Maybe I wanted to wash it. Maybe I want to run it again. And was like, okay, well, I can't risk losing these cuts. Like I can't flip them to flower without having moms and having clones and doing my due diligence. But the downside of that, or the flip side of that, is it completely bottlenecked my ability to pop seeds. And I was popping, a couple seeds at a time when I have hundreds of seeds in the drawer next to me. And that's a massive bottleneck. I'm never going to get through all those seeds. Also, not every plant is a keeper. And so, going back to the idea of popping more seeds, the leaning in to like re-veg is really where this is going. Is like Weed Shanty kind of advised me and a couple others were like, if you find something special, you can always re-veg it. It's not ideal, but if your clones don't take, like if you take clones right before flip, you give them 2 weeks to root, and you give your plants 2 weeks to show herms and show sex and show kind of performance. Some of those plants are not going to make it. You don't want 5 clones of every plant and to have them all be dudes, or have them be herms and have that mix in your mix. So that I think is a big bottleneck is like I held myself to this perfectionist standard of like, well, I'm never going to lose a cut because I'm going to be the guy who I take a cut, I make sure it's rooted before I flip it. I make sure I have dual cuts of everything, making sure you have these fail safe procedures in practice, excuse me. And at the end of the day, the result was I wasn't hunting very many seeds. So massive bottleneck. I think for a lot of people, that's probably the case. I think that I'm not able to fully lose the idea that I might find something special, but there are definitely people who are of the belief that a seed is a one-time thing. Pop the seed, grow the plant, it's over, do it again. And there's some stress-free aspects to that, and that's why we start with autos for the GROWOR, is because there is no cloning involved. You're not worrying about saving this rare unicorn that you might have popped your first seed as a first time grower, and we all have been there and been like, oh, this is going to be it. I'm going to be the lucky one. I'm just going to pop this seed. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to be a savant. And that's not the case. It's not the case for all of us. And, in 5 years, there's a couple cuts that I've lost, but overall, there hasn't been anything that I'm like, oh man, that was a bummer, And so I think recognizing where the standards you hold yourself to are very important, but if they're impeding your progress, then maybe they need to be reevaluated for their practicality.
Yeah, life is all about choices, and you just have to go with what option is getting the most check marks in that column. And as
Yeah,
a FOMO grower myself, I totally understand the bottleneck of having too many seeds and not enough time or space. So. Ben, can you remind people of your social media and where people can get in touch with you?
absolutely. You can find me at cannabinoid with an E instead of an I on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. I'm most active on LinkedIn, I would say, but Instagram and Twitter are a close second. And then you can sign up for the newsletter at thehobbygrow.com. Or if you want to learn how to do some of this stuff on your own as a hobby, whether it's growing or making hash, you can go to growhort.co or hobbyhash.com. And if you're already a grower and you want to be a cleaner grower, you can buy Clean Growing on Amazon.com.
Nice. And Ben is also an influencer on the SmartPot team. If you want to get a 10% discount at smartpots.com, enter the code HOBBYGROWER, and you will get hooked up with a little discount on your SmartPots for growing in your tent or backyard or wherever. So,
Yeah,
on that
we use
note,
them in
Ben,
and out of the house.
pardon?
I was going to say we use them in the house and we use them outside of the house in the greenhouse. My wife loves them in the greenhouse too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, on that note, Ben, thank you so much for joining us again on the podcast. And until the next time, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Have a great day.